In the freezing darkness of December 1944, the most dangerous job in the entire United States Army Air Forces was not flying a heavy bomber over Berlin. It was not escorting a formation through a wall of German flak over the Ruhr Valley. The most dangerous job in the air war was climbing into the cockpit of a brand new twin-engine attack bomber called the A-26 Invader, taking off from a muddy airstrip in eastern France and flying alone into the pitch-black winter sky over the Ardennes forest at 300 feet above the treetops. No formation, no fighter escort, no wingman. Just one fast, heavily armed aircraft, 2 men inside it, and an entire German army moving beneath them in the dark. The A-26 Invader was, on paper, the most advanced tactical aircraft the United States had ever produced. The Douglas Aircraft Company in Long Beach, California, designed it from scratch to replace every medium bomber in the American inventory. It was faster than a B-26 Marauder. It was more heavily armed than a B-25 Mitchell. It could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs internally, plus another 2,000 under the wings, and it could do all of this while flying at 355 miles per hour. That speed made it the fastest American bomber of the Second World War, faster than most fighters that were supposed to catch it. But the airplane had a problem, a serious political, institutional problem that had nothing to do with engineering. Nobody wanted it. The A-26 arrived in the European Theater of Operations in September 1944. The timing was terrible. By that point in the war, the bomber groups had already been fighting for 2 years with their B-26 Marauders and B-25 Mitchells. The crews knew those older aircraft inside and out. They had memorized every emergency procedure. They had calibrated their Norden bomb sights to drop payloads within 50 feet of the target from 12,000 feet. They had developed intricate formation tactics that protected each bomber with overlapping fields of defensive fire. The crew chiefs on the ground could strip and rebuild a Marauder engine blindfolded in the rain. And now, the Pentagon was telling them to throw all of that away and learn a completely new airplane in the middle of a war. The resistance was immediate and furious. The group commanders of the 9th Air Force hated the A-26 before they ever sat in one. The primary complaint was the cockpit visibility. The B-26 Marauder had a massive greenhouse canopy that gave the pilot a wide, panoramic view of the sky around him. He could see enemy fighters approaching from almost every direction. The A-26, by contrast, had a much lower, sleeker canopy. The designers at Douglas had optimized the shape for speed, not for sightseeing. The pilot sat lower in the fuselage, and his rearward visibility was severely restricted. In a daytime formation bombing mission, where German fighters could attack from any angle, that restricted view was a genuine tactical concern. The bomber group commanders sent a formal, written complaint back to Washington, stating that the A-26 was operationally unacceptable for combat in the European theater. General Hoyt Vandenberg, the commander of the 9th Air Force, was furious at the idea of being forced to retrain his entire command on a new airframe while actively prosecuting the air war over France and Germany. The A-26 was very nearly sent back to the United States, its entire European deployment canceled before a single bomb was dropped. The aircraft was saved by a single, stubborn officer. His name was not important to the generals in Washington. He was a lieutenant colonel commanding the 553rd Bombardment Squadron, part of the 386th Bombardment Group, stationed at a forward airfield near Beaumont-sur-Oise, about 30 miles north of Paris. He had flown dozens of missions in the older B-26 Marauder. He understood the complaints about the A-26 cockpit visibility. He agreed that the restricted view was a problem for daytime formation flying. But this officer had a completely different idea for how the A-26 should be used. He did not want to fly it in daylight formations at 12,000 feet. He wanted to fly it alone, at night, at treetop level, hunting German vehicles on the roads of occupied Europe. The logic was brutal and mathematically simple. By the autumn of 1944, Allied air superiority over France was so total, so overwhelming, that the German army could no longer move any supplies, reinforcements, or vehicles during daylight hours. Any truck, any tank, any horse-drawn wagon that moved on a road in France or Belgium during the day was immediately spotted by Allied reconnaissance aircraft and destroyed within minutes by roving fighter bombers. The Luftwaffe was so depleted that it could not provide any meaningful air cover over its own supply lines. This forced the entire German logistical network underground. Every night, as soon as the sun dropped below the horizon, thousands of German trucks, fuel tankers, ammunition carriers, and artillery tractors emerged from their camouflaged hiding positions in barns, forests, and villages. They switched on their headlights, or more often used blackout driving lights that cast only a tiny, dim slit of illumination on the road directly ahead of them. They formed long, dense convoys and drove west, toward the front lines, carrying the fuel, food, and ammunition that the German soldiers desperately needed to continue fighting. This nighttime supply chain was the beating heart of the German defense in Western Europe. Without those nightly convoys, the tanks at the front would run dry of fuel within 48 hours. The artillery batteries would exhaust their shell stockpiles within 3 days. The infantry would starve within a week. If the Allies could somehow strangle those nighttime supply convoys, the German army in France and Belgium would literally cease to function. The problem was that the Allied air forces had almost no capability to fight at night. The heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force could carpet bomb cities in darkness using radar, but they were far too large and far too inaccurate to hit individual trucks on narrow country roads. The fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt were devastating during the day, but their pilots had zero training and zero equipment for night operations. Flying a single-engine fighter at 300 feet above a forest in total darkness was considered a guaranteed, immediate death sentence. This is where the A-26 Invader suddenly became the only aircraft in the world that could do the job. It had 2 engines, which meant that if one was hit by ground fire or suffered a mechanical failure in the dark, the pilot had a fighting chance of limbing home on the remaining engine instead of immediately crashing into a hillside. It was incredibly fast, which meant it could cover long stretches of enemy road network in a single sortie and outrun any night fighter that tried to intercept it. It carried an enormous amount of firepower. The nose of the A-26 was packed with either 6 or 8 50 caliber heavy machine guns, depending on the variant. Some aircraft carried a solid nose with a devastating 75mm cannon, essentially a tank gun firing from the sky. And critically, the aircraft had the range to loiter over enemy territory for hours, circling above the dark roads, waiting for the German convoys to reveal themselves. The restricted cockpit visibility that the daytime bomber commanders hated was actually irrelevant at night. There were no enemy fighter formations to spot. There was nothing to see in any direction except blackness. The only thing that mattered was what was directly below the aircraft, on the roads, and the A-26 pilot had a perfectly adequate downward view through the lower cockpit windows. The commanding officer of the 553rd Squadron made his case directly to the 9th Air Force headquarters. He argued that the A-26 should not replace the B-26 in daytime formation bombing. It should be given a completely new, independent mission. It should become a dedicated night intruder, a lone predator flying single-ship sorties deep behind enemy lines in total darkness, systematically hunting and destroying the German supply convoys that were keeping the enemy army alive. The generals were deeply skeptical. The concept of single-aircraft night interdiction was essentially untested in the American military. The Royal Air Force had some experience with night intruder operations using the Mosquito, but the RAF had developed those tactics over years of training and specialized equipment. The American pilots had none of that. They had standard cockpit instruments, a basic radio altimeter to avoid flying into the ground, and their own eyeballs. The proposal was approved only because nobody else had an alternative. The nighttime convoys were a critical identified vulnerability in the German defense, and there was simply no other aircraft available that could exploit it. The A-26 was given a conditional, experimental authorization for night operations. If the first few missions resulted in catastrophic losses, the program would be shut down permanently, and the remaining aircraft would be shipped back to the Pacific. The pilots of the 553rd Squadron began training immediately. The training was terrifyingly minimalistic. There was no simulator. There was no specialized night flying school. The pilots practiced by taking off from their French airfield after sunset, flying circuits over the dark countryside, and learning to navigate purely by instrument readings and the faint glow of rivers and rail lines visible in the moonlight. They practiced identifying ground targets by dropping illumination flares from a low altitude and then circling back to strafe the lit-up area before the flare burned out. The key tactical challenge was absurdly simple to describe and incredibly deadly to execute. The pilot had to find German vehicles on a road in total darkness. He then had to maneuver his heavy twin-engine bomber to a position directly behind and slightly above the convoy. He had to descend to an altitude of 300 feet or less, and then he had to open fire with 850 caliber machine guns, sending a concentrated stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds into the line of trucks, fuel tankers, and ammunition wagons ahead of him. At 300 feet, flying at nearly 300 miles per hour, the margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. If the pilot pushed the nose down even 2 degrees too far during his strafing run, the aircraft would impact the ground in less than 1 second. If he failed to pull up sharply enough after passing over the target, he would fly directly into the trees on the far side of the road. If a fuel tanker in the convoy exploded from his gunfire, the resulting fireball could momentarily blind him, and at that altitude and speed, a single second of blindness meant death. The first operational night intruder missions were launched in late October 1944. The results were chaotic and terrifying. Several pilots returned to base shaking violently, reporting that they had nearly flown into church steeples and high-tension power lines that were completely invisible in the darkness. One aircraft returned with tree branches embedded in its wing leading edge, having clipped a forest canopy during a low-altitude turn. Another pilot reported that he had found a German convoy, opened fire, and then had to fly directly through the explosion of an ammunition truck that detonated at the exact moment he passed over it. The blast wave violently threw his aircraft sideways and cracked his canopy, but the rugged A-26 absorbed the punishment and kept flying. But the missions were also producing extraordinary results. The darkness that made the flying so dangerous also made the attacking aircraft nearly invisible to the German defenders on the ground. The truck drivers and convoy guards could hear the engines of the approaching A-26, but the sound of a fast aircraft in the dark gives almost no useful directional information. By the time the German soldiers on the ground identified the direction of the incoming threat, 850 caliber machine guns were already shredding their vehicles at point-blank range. The A-26 would scream overhead at 300 miles per hour, disappearing back into the blackness before a single anti-aircraft gun could be aimed and fired. The German convoy commanders began to panic. During daylight, they could at least see the attacking aircraft and attempt to scatter their vehicles off the road into fields and ditches. At night, the first indication of an attack was the sudden, deafening roar of heavy machine gun fire and the immediate explosion of the lead vehicle in the column. There was no warning. There was no time to react. The surviving drivers would slam on their brakes, throw open their doors, and dive into the roadside ditches, abandoning their vehicles. The A-26 pilot would then circle back, make a second pass, and systematically destroy every abandoned truck and fuel tanker sitting motionless on the road. Within 2 weeks of the first night intruder missions, the German Army Group B reported to Berlin that nighttime supply movements along several key roads in the Ardennes sector were suffering catastrophic, unexplained losses. Entire convoys of 15 to 20 vehicles were disappearing overnight. The supply columns were departing from their rear area depots fully loaded and simply never arriving at the front lines. The German logistics officers initially suspected partisan sabotage or landmines. It took several days before captured German soldiers revealed the truth. An unknown type of American aircraft was hunting the roads in complete darkness, and the German ground forces had absolutely no defense against it. And then, on December 16, 1944, the German army launched its final, desperate, massive counteroffensive through the frozen forests of the Ardennes. 250,000 German soldiers, backed by hundreds of tanks and assault guns, smashed through the thinly held American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and the nightly supply convoys that the A-26 Invader pilots had been quietly strangling for weeks suddenly became the single most important military targets in the entire European war. The German offensive in the Ardennes hit the American lines like a sledgehammer swung in the dark. On the morning of December 16, 1944, 250,000 German soldiers attacked across a 75-mile front through the densely forested hills of Belgium and Luxembourg. The assault was deliberately timed to exploit the worst winter weather in a decade. A massive stationary weather front had parked itself over Western Europe, blanketing the entire Ardennes region in thick freezing fog and low cloud cover that extended from the treetops to over 10,000 feet. The ceiling was so low that Allied tactical aircraft could not take off. The P-47 Thunderbolts stayed on the ground. The B-26 Marauders stayed on the ground. The entire massive infrastructure of Allied air superiority, the single greatest advantage that the Americans and British held over the German army, was completely neutralized by the weather. The German High Command had planned the entire offensive around this meteorological window. They knew that if the skies were clear, the American fighter bombers would annihilate their armored columns within hours. But under the protective blanket of fog and cloud, the German Panzer divisions could move freely during both day and night. Tiger tanks, Panther tanks, half-tracks, self-propelled guns, and endless columns of trucks poured through the gaps in the American lines, driving deep into Belgium toward the critical port city of Antwerp. The American response was chaos. The thinly spread infantry divisions holding the Ardennes were overrun in the first 48 hours. Communication lines were severed. Supply depots were captured or abandoned. Entire regiments were surrounded and cut off. The Supreme Allied Commander, working from his headquarters in Versailles, realized that the situation was far more dangerous than anyone had initially estimated. This was not a local counterattack. This was a full-scale German strategic offensive designed to split the Allied armies in half and force a negotiated settlement. And at the center of this crisis was a logistics problem that determined the life or death of the entire offensive. The German Panzer divisions advancing through the Ardennes were burning fuel at a catastrophic rate. The narrow, winding forest roads forced the heavy tanks to operate in low gear almost constantly, devouring fuel at 3 to 4 times their normal consumption rate. A single Panzer division required approximately 30,000 gallons of fuel per day to maintain its advance. The German army had started the offensive with carefully hoarded fuel reserves, but those reserves were calculated to last only until December 22nd or 23rd. After that date, the tanks would begin running dry, 1 battalion at a time, unless the nightly supply convoys from the rear depots could continuously deliver fresh fuel to the advancing spearheads. This is where the A-26 Invader became the most strategically important aircraft in the entire Allied arsenal. While every other airplane in France was grounded by the weather, the night intruder pilots of the 553rd Bombardment Squadron were still flying. They did not need clear skies. They did not need visual contact with the ground from 12,000 feet. They flew at 300 feet. At that altitude, they were below the fog ceiling. They could see the roads, the forests, and the faint glow of vehicle lights even through the murky, freezing overcast. The squadron commander called an emergency briefing on the evening of December 17th, the second day of the German offensive. The cramped briefing room in the converted farmhouse near Beaumont-sur-Oise was freezing cold, and the pilots sat on wooden benches wearing their heavy flight jackets, leather helmets, and sheepskin-lined boots. A large map of the Ardennes was pinned to the wall behind the commander. Red arrows showed the known axes of the German advance. Blue circles marked the American units that were surrounded or retreating. And running behind the red arrows, connecting the German front lines to the supply depots in the rear, were the thin black lines of the road network. The commander pointed to those roads. He told his pilots that intelligence had identified 3 primary supply routes feeding the German offensive. The first ran south from the railhead at Prum, through the town of Stadtkiel, and into the northern shoulder of the Bulge. The second ran west from the city of Bitburg, through the Our River Valley, toward the advancing Panzer spearheads near Bastogne. The third and most critical route ran from the fuel depot at Erang, near Trier, along a winding, narrow forest road through the village of Dasburg, across a single stone bridge over the Our River, and directly into the path of the 2nd Panzer Division and the Panzer Lehr Division, the 2 most powerful armored formations in the German offensive. He told his pilots that their mission was to shut those roads down, not to harass them, not to inconvenience them, to completely close them. Every fuel tanker destroyed on those roads was 30,000 gallons that would never reach a German tank. Every ammunition truck burned was an artillery battery that would fall silent. The mathematical equation was brutally simple. If they could destroy enough supply trucks on those 3 roads, the entire German offensive would physically run out of fuel and stop. The first A-26 lifted off from the dark, frozen runway at approximately 7:30 in the evening. The pilot climbed to 500 feet, turned east, and disappeared into the black, overcast sky. He was completely alone. No navigation lights, no radio contact with the ground after passing the front lines. His only instruments were the artificial horizon, the compass, the radio altimeter, and his own vision through the cold plexiglass of the cockpit. The flight to the target area took approximately 40 minutes. The pilot descended gradually as he crossed the German lines, dropping to 300 feet over the dark forest below. The Ardennes in December was a landscape of almost perfect blackness. The dense fir trees absorbed every trace of ambient light. The roads were invisible until a vehicle actually drove on them with its headlights on. Even the German blackout driving lights, which were supposed to be invisible from the air, produced a faint amber glow that was visible to a trained pilot flying at 300 feet directly overhead. He found the road from Bitburg by following the Our River Valley. The river itself was a faint, slightly lighter ribbon of reflected sky winding through the absolute blackness of the forest. The road ran parallel to the river, and within 5 minutes of reaching the valley, the pilot spotted what he was looking for, a line of tiny amber dots moving slowly westward along the road. It was a German supply convoy. He counted the lights. There were approximately 20 vehicles. The pilot checked his radio altimeter. 310 feet. He adjusted carefully, dropping 10 feet to exactly 300. He banked the heavy A-26 into a gentle right turn, positioning himself directly behind the convoy, slightly above the road. The line of amber lights was now directly ahead of him, growing slowly larger as the fast bomber overtook the slow-moving trucks. At a range of roughly 800 yards, the pilot pressed the firing button on his control yoke. 850 caliber Browning machine guns in the solid nose of the A-26 erupted simultaneously. The effect was absolutely devastating. Each gun fired at a rate of approximately 800 rounds per minute. Combined, the 8 guns produced a concentrated stream of over 6,000 heavy, armor-piercing incendiary rounds per minute, all converging on a single point, roughly 400 yards ahead of the aircraft. The tracer rounds created a terrifying, solid cone of bright white light that reached from the nose of the bomber down to the road, like a searchlight made of fire. The first vehicle in the convoy, a heavy Opel Blitz 3-ton truck, was struck by approximately 200 rounds in less than 3 seconds. The armor-piercing incendiary bullets punched through the thin metal cab, through the engine block, and into the cargo bed. The truck was carrying 80mm mortar rounds. The ammunition detonated instantly, and the truck disappeared in a massive orange fireball that lit up the forest for half a mile in every direction. The pilot instinctively flinched as the blast wave hit his aircraft, but he held the firing button down and kept the aircraft steady. The cone of tracer fire walked backward along the convoy as the A-26 overtook the line of vehicles at nearly 300 miles per hour. The second truck exploded. The third truck swerved violently off the road and rolled into the ditch. The fourth, fifth, and sixth trucks were ripped apart by the heavy machine gun fire, their canvas covers shredding and their cargoes spilling across the road. In less than 10 seconds of firing, the pilot had passed over the entire convoy. He released the firing button and immediately pulled the control yoke back hard, climbing steeply to avoid the hillside ahead. The G-forces pressed him deep into his seat. At 500 feet, he leveled off, banked hard left, and looked back over his shoulder. Behind him, a line of 6 or 7 fires was burning intensely along the dark road. The largest fire, from the ammunition truck, was a roaring column of orange flame and secondary explosions that continued for several minutes. The surviving vehicles in the rear of the convoy had stopped. Their drivers had abandoned them and fled into the forest. The pilot made a second pass, this time dropping 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs into the cluster of stopped vehicles. The bombs detonated with 2 massive double thumps of white light and concussive force that threw dirt and debris hundreds of feet into the air. When he circled back a third time, the entire stretch of road was blocked by burning wreckage. Nothing would move on that road for the rest of the night. The pilot turned northwest and headed for home. His ammunition counters showed he had expended roughly 3,000 rounds. His bomb racks were empty. Total time over the target area was less than 12 minutes. When he landed back at base, his crew chief counted 11 small holes in the underside of the wings and fuselage from light ground fire. None had hit anything critical. By midnight, 3 more A-26 aircraft had returned from their individual sorties over the Ardennes road network. The debriefing reports were almost identical. Long convoys of German supply trucks, completely undefended, moving openly on the roads in total darkness, obliterated by concentrated fire from an aircraft they never saw coming. The 4 aircraft had collectively claimed the destruction of over 40 vehicles in a single night. The missions continued every night without interruption. December 18th, December 19th, December 20th. The weather remained terrible, keeping every other Allied aircraft grounded, but the A-26 pilots flew through the fog, the sleet, and the freezing rain at 300 feet, hunting the roads of the Ardennes with mechanical precision. Each night, the pilots refined their tactics. They learned to identify fuel tanker trucks by the distinctive shape of their cylindrical cargo tanks, which reflected slightly more ambient light than the flat-sided cargo trucks. They learned to aim for the fuel tankers first, because the resulting massive explosion would illuminate the entire convoy, allowing the pilot to visually identify and destroy the remaining vehicles during the secondary passes. They also learned the geography of death. Certain stretches of road became killing zones. The narrow bridge at Dasburg, where all traffic feeding the southern axis of the German advance had to cross the Our River on a single ancient stone bridge, became the most targeted bottleneck of the entire air campaign. A-26 pilots would fly to the Dasburg Bridge, circle at 500 feet in the darkness, and simply wait. Eventually, a convoy of trucks would approach the bridge from the east. The lead vehicle would slow down to cross the narrow span, and the vehicles behind would compress into a dense, bumper-to-bumper traffic jam. The pilot would then descend behind the stationary column and open fire. The carnage at Dasburg became legendary within the squadron. The narrow approach roads on either side of the bridge were so littered with burned-out truck hulks that the German engineers had to use bulldozers to push the wreckage off the road into the river every morning, just to reopen the crossing. Aerial reconnaissance photographs taken days later showed the Our River choked with the twisted metal carcasses of dozens of destroyed vehicles downstream from the Dasburg bridge. The German logistics situation deteriorated with terrifying speed. On December 22nd, the lead elements of the 2nd Panzer Division reached the outskirts of the village of Chell, barely 4 miles from the Meuse River. If they crossed the Meuse, the road to Antwerp would be open. But the tanks of the 2nd Panzer Division had less than a quarter tank of fuel remaining. Their supply convoy, carrying the diesel and gasoline needed to push the final 4 miles to the river, had been destroyed on the road near Dasburg the previous night by a single A-26 Invader. The tanks sat immobile in the frozen forest, their engines silent, waiting for fuel that would never arrive. They were sitting there when the weather finally cleared on December 23rd, and the American fighter bombers descended on them like a storm of fire. The weather broke on December 23rd, 1944. For the first time in a week, the thick overcast ceiling over the Ardennes lifted, and a cold, pale winter sun appeared above the frozen battlefield. Within hours, the skies over Belgium were filled with hundreds of Allied aircraft. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, RAF Typhoons, and formations of B-26 Marauders descended on the exposed German columns with devastating precision. The daytime air offensive was catastrophic for the German forces. Entire panzer columns that had been advancing confidently under the protective fog were caught in the open and systematically destroyed. But the generals who celebrated the clear weather air assault were missing a critical piece of the tactical picture. The German offensive had not been stopped by the daylight fighter bombers on December 23rd. It had been stopped 3 days earlier, in the darkness, by a handful of twin-engine bombers that almost nobody in the Allied command structure knew existed. The mathematical proof was already written on the frozen roads of the Ardennes. The 2nd Panzer Division, the sharpest tip of the German spear, had reached the village of Chell on December 24th, just 4 miles from the Meuse River and the open road to Antwerp. This was the deepest penetration of the entire German offensive. It was also the exact point where the offensive died. The 2nd Panzer Division arrived at Chell with its fuel tanks nearly empty. The division commander radioed desperately to his corps headquarters, demanding immediate delivery of fuel. The reply was devastating. The fuel convoy had been scheduled to cross the Our River Bridge at Dasburg the previous night. It never arrived. The entire convoy of tanker trucks had been destroyed on the road east of the bridge by an unknown American aircraft operating in total darkness. Without fuel, the 2nd Panzer Division could not advance. Its tanks could not maneuver. Its armored vehicles sat frozen in the December forest, like expensive, heavily armored statues. When the American 2nd Armored Division counterattacked on Christmas Day, December 25th, the German tanks could not even retreat. They were physical, immovable objects. The American Shermans drove directly into the stranded German positions and destroyed 82 Panzer tanks and associated vehicles in a single, devastating engagement. The 2nd Panzer Division, one of the most feared armored formations in the German army, was functionally annihilated, not by a superior tank, not by a brilliant ground maneuver, by the absence of 30,000 gallons of diesel fuel that had been burned on a road in the darkness by a single A-26 Invader. The same pattern repeated itself across the entire front. The Panzer Lehr Division, attacking toward Bastogne from the southeast, found its fuel supplies critically short by December 22nd, forcing the division to slow its advance and eventually halt. The 116th Panzer Division, driving toward the Meuse from the northern shoulder of the Bulge, reported on December 21st that its fuel reserves had dropped below operational minimums. Captured German documents later revealed that the nightly destruction of supply convoys on the three primary Ardennes supply routes had reduced German fuel deliveries by an estimated 40 to 60% during the critical first week of the offensive. The A-26 pilots did not know any of this during the battle. They were too busy flying to analyze the strategic implications of their nightly work. The missions had become a grinding, relentless routine. Every evening at sunset, the pilots gathered in the freezing briefing room, received their assigned road segments, walked out to their aircraft, and took off into the darkness. Every night, they flew 2 or 3 individual sorties, each lasting 2 to 3 hours. Every night they found German convoys and destroyed them, and every night the flying became more dangerous. The German army was not stupid. The flak batteries that defended the rear area supply routes were rapidly reinforced as the scale of the nighttime losses became clear to the German command. The convoy commanders began attaching mobile 20mm anti-aircraft guns mounted on half-track vehicles to the supply columns. These flak half-tracks would drive in the middle of the convoy, and when an attacking aircraft revealed its position by opening fire, the rapid-fire 20mm guns would immediately spray the sky with tracer rounds, saturating the area where the aircraft was estimated to be. The A-26 pilots discovered this new tactic the hard way. On the night of December 21st, a pilot from the 553rd Squadron was making his second pass over a destroyed convoy near the village of Prum, when the darkness around him suddenly erupted with bright red tracer fire from 3 different positions on the ground. A 20mm shell struck his left engine nacelle, severing a fuel line. Aviation gasoline immediately began spraying across the hot engine, and the left wing erupted in a sheet of orange flame that was visible for miles. The pilot's instinct was to bail out, but at 300 feet, there was no time to open the canopy, disconnect his harness, and jump. The parachute would never deploy in time. He had exactly one option. He reached forward with his left hand and activated the engine fire extinguisher, a small bottle of carbon dioxide that discharged directly into the engine compartment. He simultaneously feathered the left propeller, cutting fuel flow to the burning engine. With his right hand, he pushed the remaining right engine to full emergency power and pulled the aircraft into a desperate climb. The fire extinguisher worked. The flames on the left wing died to a smoldering glow and then went dark. But the left engine was completely dead, and the aircraft was now flying on a single engine in total darkness over enemy territory, with a damaged fuel system leaking gasoline into the airstream. The pilot turned west and nursed the crippled A-26 back across the German lines, navigating purely by compass and altimeter. He crossed the front lines at approximately 400 feet, found his home airfield by spotting the faint glow of the runway flare pots through the freezing mist, and made a single-engine landing on the dark, icy runway. The ground crew found that the left engine was completely destroyed. The left wing skin was blackened and blistered from the fire, and a 20mm shell had passed through the fuselage less than 8 inches from the pilot's left knee. The aircraft was repaired in 4 days and returned to combat. By Christmas Day, the German supply situation in the Ardennes had become genuinely catastrophic. The nightly raids by the A-26 Invaders had destroyed so many trucks and fuel tankers on the primary supply routes that the German logistics system was physically collapsing. Replacement vehicles were being pulled from rear area depots across western Germany and rushed to the Ardennes, but those replacement trucks were also being destroyed on the same roads within days of arriving. The A-26 pilots had created a self-reinforcing cycle of destruction. The more trucks the Germans sent to replace the ones that had been destroyed, the more targets appeared on the roads for the A-26 to hunt. German soldiers captured during the last days of December consistently reported the same complaint to their American interrogators. They had not received hot food in days. Their ammunition resupply had been cut to less than half of what was needed, and most critically, their vehicles had no fuel. Tank commanders described receiving orders to advance toward specific objectives and then having to report back that they physically could not move because their fuel tanks were dry. Artillery batteries reported having fewer than 30 rounds per gun, when the standard daily allocation was over 200. On the night of December 27, 1944, the A-26 pilots of the 553rd Squadron achieved what would later be calculated as their single most devastating sortie of the entire Ardennes campaign. A pilot flying over the road between Stadtkiel and Prum discovered a massive German supply convoy that had been forced to stop on the road due to a destroyed bridge ahead. The convoy was enormous, stretching for over 2 kilometers along the narrow forest road. The vehicles were bumper to bumper, completely unable to move forward or turn around on the narrow, snow-banked road. The pilot made a single radio call to his base, breaking the standard radio silence to report the target. Within 40 minutes, 2 additional A-26 aircraft arrived over the area. The 3 bombers divided the convoy into thirds and began a systematic, methodical destruction that lasted over 90 minutes. The first pilot dropped a string of parachute flares that illuminated the entire road in a ghostly, swinging white light. Beneath the flares, the scene was almost surreal. Hundreds of German trucks, fuel tankers, horse-drawn wagons, and staff cars were packed together on the narrow road, completely immobile. The German soldiers were running in every direction, diving into snowbanks and ditches, trying to escape the brilliant illumination that they knew would be immediately followed by heavy machine gun fire. The 3 A-26 aircraft made repeated passes along the length of the convoy, firing their combined .24-50 caliber machine guns into the dense mass of vehicles. The effect was indescribable. Fuel tankers exploded in massive rolling fireballs that set the surrounding trees on fire. Ammunition trucks detonated in violent, secondary chain reactions that sent shrapnel and debris hundreds of feet into the air. The heavy incendiary rounds punched through engine blocks, cab armors, and cargo beds with equal ease, setting fires that spread rapidly from vehicle to vehicle in the densely packed column. When the 3 aircraft had exhausted their machine gun ammunition, they switched to bombs. Each A-26 carried 4 500-pound general-purpose bombs under its wings. The 12 bombs were dropped in a staggered pattern along the length of the burning convoy, detonating with massive concussive blasts that flipped the lighter trucks onto their sides and collapsed the roadbed into a series of impassable craters. The 3 pilots flew home in the early morning darkness. When daylight reconnaissance aircraft photographed the road between Stadtkiel and Prum later that morning, the images showed a continuous line of destruction stretching for over 2 kilometers. Intelligence analysts counted the burned and destroyed vehicles in the photographs. The final tally was 119 vehicles confirmed destroyed in a single night. It included 23 fuel tanker trucks, whose cargoes alone represented approximately 70,000 gallons of fuel that would never reach the German front lines. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, when the last German forces were pushed back to their starting positions along the Siegfried Line. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and capture Antwerp had failed completely. The standard historical narrative attributes the failure to the heroic defense of Bastogne by the 101st Airborne Division, the counterattack by General Patton's Third Army, and the return of clear weather on December 23rd that unleashed the full power of Allied tactical air. All of those factors were critically important, but the classified after-action reports told a more nuanced and mathematically precise story. The German offensive ran out of fuel. It did not run out of soldiers. It did not run out of tanks. It did not run out of ammunition or willpower. It ran out of the one thing that no modern army can function without: diesel fuel and gasoline. And the primary reason it ran out of fuel was that, during the critical first week of the offensive, when the weather grounded every other Allied aircraft, A small number of A-26 Invaders, flying alone in the freezing darkness, systematically destroyed the supply convoys that were carrying that fuel to the front. The final operational statistics of the A-26 Night Intruder campaign in the Ardennes were compiled after the war. During the Bulge, the 553rd Bombardment Squadron and the other A-26 units flying night interdiction missions destroyed over 800 vehicles, including fuel tankers, ammunition trucks, and troop transports. They destroyed or damaged over 40 bridges and road junctions. They dropped over 2 million pounds of ordnance on German supply routes during night operations alone. The loss rate for the A-26 Invader during these missions was remarkably low. The aircraft's extreme speed, its ability to operate in weather that grounded every other plane, and the cover of total darkness made it an incredibly difficult target for German defenses. The A-26 would go on to serve in the Korean War and later in Vietnam, where it was redesignated the B-26 Invader, continuing its role as a night interdiction specialist for another 20 years after the Second World War ended. But the true legacy of the A-26 in the Ardennes was not measured in vehicles destroyed or bombs dropped. It was measured in the silence of the German tanks that sat motionless in the frozen forests of Belgium on Christmas morning, 1944, their engines cold, their fuel tanks empty, their crews staring westward toward the Meuse River that they would never reach. Those tanks had been stopped not by a battle, but by a mathematical equation written in fire on the dark country roads behind them. 8 machine guns, 300 feet, total darkness. The formula was simple. The result was the death of the last German offensive of the Second World War,